Chapter 1. Whispers of Snowfall. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Ashwick, carrying with it the icy breath of an impending storm. Christmas lights flickered like tiny beacons against the gloom, their cheerfulness defiant in the face of the approaching blizzard. Carla Bennett pulled her scarf tighter around her neck as she trudged through the slush, her boots crunching with every determined step. The smell of pine and roasted chestnuts wafted through the air, but she was in no mood to savor the charm. Ashwick, she thought, was a town trapped in a perpetual snow globe, picturesque, quaint, and far too idealistic for her taste. The so-called Christmas miracle was the perfect example of its saccharine allure. Every year, like clockwork, the town would receive a generous anonymous donation that funded festivities, paid off debts, and even provided gifts for children who might otherwise go without. It was the kind of story people ate up, the kind that made her editor demand a feature every year. And every year, Carla had managed to avoid it. Not this year. Her editor had been insistent. People want feel-good stories during the holidays, Carla. Get to the heart of it. Find out who's behind this and why they're doing it. But Carla wasn't here to write a puff piece. She was here to uncover the truth, however inconvenient it might be. The town's economy relied heavily on tourism, and she couldn't shake the suspicion that the Christmas miracle was nothing more than a clever marketing ploy. She reached the town square, where a towering Christmas tree adorned with gold and silver ornaments stood like a sentinel. Beneath it, children laughed as they chased each other, their voices blending with the distant strains of carolers. Carla's eyes narrowed. This was the kind of scene her editor wanted on the cover. Wholesome, magical, a Norman Rockwell painting brought to life. She reached into her bag, pulling out a notebook and pen, and began jotting observations. "You look like someone who's been assigned homework," a warm voice interrupted. Startled, Carla turned to see a man in a wool coat and a scarf patterned with tiny snowflakes. He had the kind of easy smile that seemed entirely too genuine for her liking. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone sharper than intended. He chuckled. "Just thought I'd say hello. You're not from around here, are you?" "What gave it away?" Carla replied dryly, tucking her notebook back into her bag. "For one, you're not smiling. That's practically a requirement in Ashwick this time of year." "I'll make a note of it," she said, turning to leave. Wait, he said, stepping in front of her. "I didn't mean to offend. I'm Chris, by the way. Chris Harper." "Carla Bennett," she said reluctantly, shaking his outstretched hand. "Nice to meet you, Carla. So, what brings you to our little slice of Christmas heaven?" "Work," she said curtly. Chris tilted his head, his curiosity evident. "Journalist?" "Yes." Here for the Christmas miracle, then?" Carla's eyes narrowed. "You seem awfully sure of that." "It's a small town," he said with a shrug. "Word gets around. Besides, you have that look." "What look?" "The look of someone who doesn't believe in miracles." Carla opened her mouth to retort, but before she could, the wind picked up, sending a flurry of snowflakes swirling around them. Chris's scarf fluttered like a banner, and for a moment, Carla caught a glimpse of something unguarded in his expression. A quiet, almost wistful belief that made her uncomfortable. "I don't believe in things I can't prove," she said finally. "Maybe you're just not looking hard enough," Chris replied. Before she could respond, a voice called out from across the square. "Chris, we need your help with the nativity scene." Chris gave her an apologetic smile. "Duty calls. But if you're looking for proof, maybe stick around. Miracles have a way of finding you when you least expect them." He turned and jogged off, leaving Carla standing alone in the snow. She watched him go, her journalist's instincts kicking in. Chris Harper, she decided, was someone worth keeping an eye on. By the time she reached the inn where she was staying, the storm was in full swing. The innkeeper, rosy-cheeked woman named Margaret, greeted her warmly and handed her a mug of steaming cocoa. "Looks like you're in for a long night," Margaret said. "They're predicting the roads will be impassable by morning." "Great," Carla muttered, taking a sip of the cocoa. She glanced out the window, where the snow was falling so thickly it obscured everything beyond a few feet. She had hoped to make some progress on her investigation tonight, but it seemed the storm had other plans. As she sat by the fire, her mind drifted back to Chris. There was something about him she couldn't quite put her finger on. He was too earnest. People weren't supposed to be that sincere, were they? Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was her editor. "How's it going?" he asked. "Slow," Carla admitted, "but I'll figure it out." "Good. We're counting on you, Carla. This story could be big." She hung up, her resolve hardening. She didn't believe in miracles, but she did believe in uncovering the truth. And if that meant digging into Ashwick's most cherished tradition, so be it. Outside, the snow whispered against the windows, as if conspiring to tell its own story. But Carla wasn't listening. Not yet. Chapter 2. The Frost Between Us. The next morning, the world outside Carla's window had transformed into an endless expanse of white. Snow clung to the branches of trees, draped rooftops like heavy blankets, and rendered the roads completely impassable. From her seat by the window, she could see the townspeople bustling around in thick coats, shoveling paths and helping one another dig out cars buried under feet of snow. Ashwick's unyielding cheerfulness was on full display. Carla sighed, setting her coffee cup on the windowsill. The storm had forced her to put her investigation on hold, but she was determined to use the downtime productively. Pulling her laptop from her bag, she began reviewing her notes. So far, all she had was the same recycled narrative the town loved to tell. An anonymous benefactor, a mysterious miracle, and a community that thrived on hope. It was all too neat, too perfect. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. She frowned, setting her laptop aside as she went to answer it. Standing in the hallway was Chris Harper, bundled in a thick parka and holding a tray of pastries covered in a cloth. "Morning," he said, flashing that same disarming smile. "Thought you might want some breakfast. Margaret makes the best cinnamon rolls in town." Carla blinked, caught off guard by his sudden appearance. "How did you know where I was staying?" Chris shrugged. "Small town, remember? Besides, Margaret's my aunt." "Ah," Carla said, eyeing him suspiciously. "So, what's this? An attempt to butter up the big city journalist?" "Think of it as a peace offering," Chris said, unfazed. "You didn't seem too thrilled to talk yesterday." Carla hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. "Fine, but only because I'm starving," Chris chuckled, setting the tray on the small table by the window. As Carla poured them both coffee, he pulled off his coat and took a seat, looking completely at ease despite the frostiness in her tone. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair, "how's the investigation going?" "Slow," Carla admitted. "People here are tight-lipped. Maybe they're just protective," Chris suggested. "The Christmas miracle means a lot to this town." "Why?" Carla asked, folding her arms. "Because it's good for tourism?" Chris's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of something more serious. "No, because it reminds us of what's important. Community, kindness, faith in something bigger than ourselves." Carla raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like a tagline for a Hallmark movie." Chris laughed, but the warmth didn't quite reach his eyes. "Maybe it does, but it's the truth. You'd see that if you spent more time with the people here." "Maybe," Carla said noncommittally, taking a bite of a cinnamon roll. To her annoyance, it was as delicious as Chris had promised. The conversation shifted to lighter topics as they ate, but Carla couldn't shake the feeling that Chris was holding something back. He seemed genuinely passionate about the Christmas miracle, but his intensity made her wonder if there was more to his connection to it than he was letting on. After breakfast, Chris stood and shrugged into his coat. "You should come to the town meeting tonight," he said. "It's at the community center. They'll be discussing plans for the Christmas Eve festival." "Is that your subtle way of saying I need to mingle more?" Carla asked dryly. Chris grinned. "Maybe." Before she could respond, he added, "And if you're lucky, you might even learn something useful for your article." With that, he was gone, leaving Carla to stew over his parting words. She hated to admit it, but he was right. If she wanted to crack this story, she needed to get closer to the people of Ashwick. And if that meant enduring a few hours of forced holiday cheer, so be it. The community center was buzzing with activity when Carla arrived that evening. The scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air, and tables were lined with trays of cookies and mugs of hot cider. Children darted between clusters of adults, their laughter echoing off the walls. It was almost enough to make Carla forget the biting cold outside. She scanned the room, her journalist's eye noting the dynamics at play. There was Margaret, bustling around with a clipboard, herding volunteers like a seasoned general. Near the stage, a group of older men were engaged in a spirited debate, their booming voices punctuated by bursts of laughter. And in the center of it all was Chris, effortlessly charming everyone he spoke to. Carla kept her distance, observing as he moved through the crowd. He had a way of making people feel at ease, and she couldn't deny his charisma. But she wasn't here to be charmed. She was here to uncover the truth. As the meeting began, the town's mayor, a jovial man named Harold, took the stage. He spoke at length about the preparations for the festival, thanking volunteers and highlighting the importance of the Christmas miracle in bringing the town together. Carla took copious notes, her pen flying across the page as she tried to parse the genuine sentiment from the rehearsed platitudes. When the meeting ended, Carla made her way to Chris, who was helping stack chairs. "You're really committed to this, aren't you?" she said, her tone more curious than accusatory. Chris straightened, brushing his hands off on his jeans. "It's important to me," he said simply. "Why?" Carla pressed. "What's your connection to the Christmas miracle?" Chris hesitated, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of hesitation in his otherwise steady demeanor. "Let's just say it's personal," he said finally. Before she could probe further, a voice called his name. He gave her an apologetic smile and excused himself, leaving Carla with more questions than answers. As she walked back to the inn, the snow crunching underfoot, Carla couldn't help but feel the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift. There was something about Chris, something about this town, that didn't quite add up, and she was determined to figure out what it was, no matter how long it took. Chapter 3: Cracks in the Ice. The morning after the town meeting, Carla awoke to the sound of laughter outside her window. Pulling back the curtain, she saw a group of children bundled in colorful coats, dragging sleds through the freshly fallen snow. Their faces were alight with pure, unfiltered joy, a stark contrast to her own guarded cynicism. She rubbed the sleep from her eyes and turned to her laptop, the blinking cursor on her blank document taunting her. Despite her determination to unravel Ashwick's cherished Christmas miracle, she had made little progress. Chris Harper remained an enigma. The town's unwavering faith in the miracle baffled her, and she still hadn't found a single lead to suggest the story was anything but a heartwarming myth. Margaret, the innkeeper, knocked softly on the door and entered with a tray of tea and toast. "Good morning, dear," she said, her voice as warm as the fire crackling downstairs. "Thought you might like a little breakfast to start your day." "Thank you," Carla replied, accepting the tray. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" The older woman paused, a knowing smile playing at her lips. "You want to know about the Christmas miracle, don't you?" Carla nodded, setting the tray on the small table by the window. "It's why I'm here. But no one seems willing to talk about it." Margaret's expression softened. It's not that people don't want to talk about it, dear. It's just, the miracle is special to this town. Sacred, even. People are protective of it. Why? Carla pressed. What's so sacred about an anonymous donation? Margaret chuckled. You're looking at it like an outsider, Carla. But to us, it's not just the money. It's the way it brings people together. The way it reminds us of what Christmas is truly about. Carla's pen hovered over her notebook. Do you know who the benefactor is? Margaret's smile faded slightly. No one does. And maybe that's the point. It's not about who gives the gift, but what it represents. Carla fought the urge to roll her eyes. She thanked Margaret for the breakfast and promised to join the festivities later, though she wasn't sure how much more cheer she could stomach. Later that day, Carla decided to explore the town further. Armed with her camera and notebook, she wandered through the snow-dusted streets, stopping to snap pictures of the charming storefronts and festive decorations. Every corner of Ashwick seemed to exude holiday spirit, from the wreaths on every door to the twinkling lights strung across the rooftops. She found herself drawn to the town's small library, a quaint building with frosted windows and a hand-painted sign above the door. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of old books and pine. A middle-aged librarian with kind eyes looked up from her desk and smiled. "Welcome," she said. "Let me know if you need any help." Carla returned the smile and began browsing the shelves. Her fingers traced the spines of books on local history, folklore, and Christmas traditions. She pulled one down and flipped through its pages, pausing at a section about Ashwick's unique customs. There was a brief mention of the Christmas miracle, but nothing she didn't already know. Disappointed, she returned the book and turned to leave, only to nearly collide with Chris Harper. "We've got to stop meeting like this," he said with a grin. Carla groaned inwardly. "Do you just happen to be everywhere? Or are you following me?" "It's a small town," Chris said with a shrug. "Plus, the library's the best place to warm up after working outside all morning." "What were you working on?" "Fixing a neighbor's roof," he said casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Snow did a number on it overnight." Carla studied him, searching for any hint of pretense, but found none. "You're really dedicated to this place, aren't you?" "It's home," Chris said simply, "and everyone looks out for each other here." "That's how it's always been." They stood in silence for a moment, the quiet of the library wrapping around them like a blanket. Carla felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite identify, a curiosity, a pull toward this man who seemed to embody everything she didn't believe in. "You should come to the tree lighting ceremony tonight," Chris said, breaking the silence. "It's one of the best parts of Christmas in Ashwick." Carla hesitated. "I don't know." "Come on," Chris urged. "You might actually enjoy yourself." She wanted to refuse, to stay focused on her investigation, but something about the sincerity in his voice made her relent. "Fine," she said, "but only because I'm curious." Chris's grin widened. "I'll see you there." The town square was alive with energy that evening. Families gathered around the towering Christmas tree, their faces illuminated by the glow of lanterns and strings of lights. Carla stood on the outskirts of the crowd, her camera slung over her shoulder, taking it all in. Chris spotted her and made his way through the crowd, holding 2 cups of hot cocoa. "Figured you might need this," he said, handing one to her. "Thanks," she said, taking a cautious sip. It was delicious, rich and creamy with just the right amount of sweetness. The mayor stepped onto a small stage at the base of the tree, his voice booming over the chatter. "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, it's time to light the tree." The crowd cheered as he began the countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The tree came alive with light, a cascade of gold and silver illuminating the square. The crowd erupted into applause, and Carla couldn't help but feel a pang of something unfamiliar. A warmth, a connection to the joy around her. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Chris said, his voice soft beside her. Carla glanced at him, caught off guard by the sincerity in his expression. "Yeah," she admitted. "It is." For a moment, the skeptic in her was silent, and all she could hear was the music of the season and the quiet hum of possibility. Chapter 4. Kindling the Fire. The next morning, Ashwick lay under a pristine blanket of snow. The town's rooftops sparkled under the winter sun, and the air was sharp and bracing, the kind of cold that carried whispers of adventure. Carla sat by the window of the inn, sipping coffee and watching the townspeople bustle through the streets. Despite her initial skepticism, there was something undeniably charming about the place. Her thoughts wandered to the tree-lighting ceremony from the previous night. For the first time in years, she had felt a flicker of the holiday spirit she had so resolutely ignored. It wasn't just the lights or the music. It was the warmth of the people, the sense of togetherness. And, if she were being honest, it was Chris. His unwavering belief in the Christmas miracle both intrigued and frustrated her. Determined to focus, Carla grabbed her coat, scarf, and notebook. She needed answers, and she wasn't going to find them sitting idly in her room. Her first stop was the mayor's office. If anyone knew the truth about the Christmas miracle, it would be Mayor Benson. Mayor Benson's office was a modest affair, with a small desk, a few chairs, and walls adorned with photographs of past Christmas celebrations. The mayor himself was a jovial man with a round face and a permanent twinkle in his eye. He greeted Carla with a firm handshake and a warm smile. "Miss Reed, what can I do for you today?" he asked, gesturing for her to take a seat. Carla pulled out her notebook and pen. "I'm writing a piece on Ashwick's Christmas miracle, and I was hoping you could shed some light on its history." The mayor leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Ah, the miracle. It's been a part of Ashwick for as long as I can remember. Every year, like clockwork, that anonymous gift arrives. It's brought this town through hard times, reminded us of the importance of kindness and generosity. Do you have any idea who the benefactor might be?" Carla pressed. Mayor Benson shook his head. "If anyone knows, they've kept it to themselves. It's become something of an unspoken rule not to dig too deep. The miracle's magic lies in its mystery." Carla frowned. "But don't you think the people of Ashwick deserve to know the truth?" The mayor's smile faltered for a moment. "Truth is important, Miss Reed, but so is hope. Sometimes, it's the not knowing that keeps the spirit alive." Carla left the office with more questions than answers. As much as she admired the mayor's sentiment, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Her next stop was the town's archives, housed in the back of the library. The librarian, Mrs. Holloway, greeted her warmly and led her to a room filled with dusty records and old newspapers. "You'll find everything we have about the miracle in these files," Mrs. Holloway said, gesturing to a stack of boxes. "Let me know if you need any help." Carla spent hours combing through the documents. The miracle's origins were hazy at best. The first recorded mention was over 50 years ago, in a newspaper article about an anonymous donation that had saved the town's struggling school. Over the years, the gifts had varied in size and purpose, paying off medical debts, funding community projects, helping families in need. But the benefactor's identity had remained a mystery. Just as she was about to call it a day, Carla came across a faded photograph tucked into one of the files. It showed a group of townspeople gathered in front of the Christmas tree. At the center stood a man and a woman, their faces lit with joy. There was something about the man's eyes, a spark of recognition she couldn't place. She tucked the photo into her notebook and made a mental note to investigate further. That evening, Carla found herself wandering the streets of Ashwick, the photograph weighing heavily on her mind. She spotted Chris outside the general store, helping an elderly woman load groceries into her car. She hesitated, then approached him. Busy day? She asked, falling into step beside him as he walked back toward the square. Always, he said with a smile. What about you? I've been doing some digging, she admitted. Found an interesting photo in the archives. Chris raised an eyebrow. What kind of photo? Carla pulled the picture from her notebook and handed it to him. Recognize anyone? Chris studied the image, his brow furrowing. That's my grandfather, he said softly, pointing to the man in the center. And my grandmother. Carla's heart skipped a beat. Your grandparents? Chris nodded, his expression thoughtful. They were deeply involved in the community. My grandfather used to say that Christmas was the time to remind people of their worth. Carla's mind raced. Could Chris's family be connected to the miracle? If so, why had the tradition continued even after his grandparents' time? Chris, do you think your family could have started the miracle? He hesitated, then shook his head. I don't know, but if they did, it wasn't about recognition. It was about helping people. That's what Christmas is all about. Carla's skepticism wavered. For the first time, she began to see the miracle not as a mystery to be solved, but as a gift to be cherished. Still, the journalist in her wasn't ready to let go of the story. Thanks for sharing this with me, she said, tucking the photo back into her notebook. Chris smiled. Anytime. Just don't let it ruin the magic. As they parted ways, Carla felt a strange mix of emotions. The closer she got to the truth, the more she questioned what she was really searching for. In the quiet of the snowy night, she realized that the miracle wasn't just about the town or its mysterious benefactor. It was about her, and the walls she had built around her own heart. Chapter 5. Shadows in the Candlelight. The next morning dawned with a quiet stillness, the kind that only comes after a night of fresh snowfall. Carla awoke to find the world outside her window transformed into a white wonderland. The streets of Ashwick seemed softer somehow, muted and gentle under the thick layer of snow. She sat up in bed, her thoughts immediately drifting to the photograph she had found the day before. The faces of Chris's grandparents lingered in her mind, their expressions warm and full of purpose. After a quick breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast at the inn, Carla bundled up and headed into town. The air was crisp and sharp, the kind that nipped at her nose and cheeks. She decided to visit a place Chris had mentioned in passing the previous evening, the old pine grove on the edge of town. He'd said it was a place his grandfather often visited, a spot where he claimed to find inspiration and clarity. Carla wasn't one for sentimental notions, but something about the idea intrigued her. If Chris's grandfather had been involved in the origins of the Christmas miracle, maybe this grove held some clues. The path to the pine grove was unmarked, winding its way through dense trees and over gentle hills. Carla's boots crunched against the packed snow as she walked, her breath visible in small puffs that dissipated into the frigid air. She clutched her notebook tightly, ready to jot down any observations that might spark an idea. When she finally reached the grove, Carla paused, taking in the sight before her. The towering pines stood in a perfect circle, their branches heavy with snow. In the center of the clearing was a wooden bench, weathered but sturdy, and a small stone plaque embedded in the ground. Carla's curiosity flared as she approached the plaque, brushing away the snow to reveal the words etched into the surface. To those who believe in the magic of giving, the greatest gift is love. Carla traced the inscription with her gloved fingers, her mind racing. It was a simple message, but it carried a weight that resonated deep within her. She sat down on the bench, pulling out the photograph once more. Could this place have been a source of inspiration for Chris's grandparents? And if so, what did it mean for the miracle itself? As Carla sat lost in thought, the sound of approaching footsteps startled her. She turned to see Chris emerging from the trees, his expression one of surprise and amusement. "Didn't expect to find you here," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. Carla offered a half-smile. I figured it was worth checking out. You said your grandfather used to come here a lot. Chris nodded, his gaze drifting to the plaque. He did. He said this place reminded him of what really mattered. Family, kindness, community. Did he ever talk about the miracle? Carla asked, her voice gentle but probing. Chris hesitated, then sat down beside her. Not directly, but he always said that Christmas wasn't just a holiday. It was a chance to show people they weren't alone, to remind them that even in the darkest times, there's light. Carla's pen hovered over her notebook. Do you think he's the one who started it? Chris shook his head slowly. I don't know. Maybe. But if he did, I'm not sure he'd want anyone to know. It was never about credit for him. It was about the act itself. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the occasional rustle of wind through the trees and the faint chirping of birds. Carla found herself unexpectedly moved by Chris's words. There was a purity to his belief, a sincerity that made her question her own cynicism. Later that afternoon, Carla returned to the inn, her mind still spinning with questions. She spread out her notes on the small desk in her room, trying to piece together the fragments of the story. The plaque, the photograph, the mysterious gifts, it all pointed to something bigger, something that went beyond a simple act of generosity. As she worked, a knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Mrs. Holloway, the librarian, standing there with a wrapped package in her hands. I thought you might find this interesting, Mrs. Holloway said, handing Carla the package. It was tucked away in the archives. I'm not sure how I missed it before. Carla thanked her and closed the door, tearing the wrapping off to reveal a leather-bound journal. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, the ink faded but still legible. As she flipped through the entries, Carla's heart began to race. The journal belonged to Chris's grandfather. It detailed his thoughts, his dreams, and most intriguingly, his plans for what he called the Ashwick tradition. The entry spoke of his desire to create something that would bring the town together, to inspire kindness and generosity in a way that would last for generations. Carla's hands trembled as she read the final entry, dated just a few weeks before his death. The true miracle isn't in the giving. It's in the belief that, no matter how small the act, it can change a life. If we hold on to that, we can make the world a little brighter. Carla closed the journal, her heart heavy with emotion. The story she had been chasing wasn't about uncovering a mystery. It was about understanding the power of hope, of belief, of love. For the first time, she began to see the miracle not as an enigma to be solved, but as a legacy to be honored. As night fell over Ashwick, Carla knew her journey was far from over. But for the first time, she felt she was on the right path. Chapter 6: A Blizzard of Secrets. The streets of Ashwick glowed faintly under the soft light of the street lamps as Carla wandered back to her room at the inn. She carried Chris's grandfather's journal tightly against her chest, its weight heavier than she expected, as though it held the burden of the town's past. Every page she'd read had been a window into a man she'd never met, yet who seemed to know so much about the essence of giving and hope. Once in her room, Carla set the journal on the desk and lit a small candle to fight off the encroaching darkness of the snowy night. A single flame flickered, its warmth spreading across the cramped space. The journal beckoned, but her mind was too full to dive back into its pages immediately. Instead, she turned her thoughts to Chris. He had been so earnest in the grove, speaking about his grandfather's philosophy of life and love with the kind of conviction Carla rarely saw in people. It unnerved her, but it also drew her closer. It was as though his belief in the good of the world had been carved into his very being. She sighed, pulling her sweater tighter around her shoulders, and decided she couldn't keep the journal to herself. Chris deserved to know what she'd found. The next morning, Carla made her way to Chris's cabin. The snow had been shoveled from the path leading to his front porch, and she could see smoke curling from the chimney. She knocked twice before the door swung open, revealing Chris bundled in flannel and wearing a smile that made the morning feel warmer. "Carla, this is a surprise. Come in. You must be freezing," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. Inside, the cabin was cozy, filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and pine. Carla's eyes were drawn to the Christmas tree in the corner, adorned with handmade ornaments that looked as though they'd been passed down through generations. "Nice place," she said, shrugging off her coat. "Feels like Christmas exploded in here." Chris chuckled. "My mom always went overboard with decorations. Guess I've picked up the habit." "Coffee?" "Sure," Carla replied, taking a seat on the couch. She pulled the journal from her bag and set it on the coffee table. Chris placed a mug of steaming coffee in front of her, his eyes narrowing as he noticed the worn leather cover of the book. "What's that?" he asked, sitting across from her. "It belonged to your grandfather," Carla said. "Mrs. Holloway found it in the archives and brought it to me. I thought you might want to see it." Chris leaned forward, his fingers brushing the cover reverently. "I didn't know this existed. It's incredible," Carla said softly. "He wrote about his vision for Ashwick, about wanting to create something that would unite people. It's all in here." Chris opened the journal carefully, flipping through its pages as though they might disintegrate under his touch. Carla watched as his eyes scanned the faded handwriting, his expression shifting between wonder and sorrow. "He was a dreamer," Chris said after a while. "I always knew that. But reading this, it's like hearing his voice again." "There's something else," Carla said, hesitant. "One of the entries talks about an old bell tower. Do you know anything about that?" Chris frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. The old church on the edge of town used to have a bell tower. It's been abandoned for decades, though. "Why?" "Your grandfather wrote about it being a symbol. He said it was a place where people came together, where they felt connected to something bigger than themselves. I think it might be important." Chris closed the journal and looked at her, his eyes serious. "You think it has something to do with the miracle?" "I don't know," Carla admitted, "but I think it's worth investigating." That afternoon, Carla and Chris trudged through the snow toward the old church. The building stood at the edge of the forest, its stone walls weathered and ivy-covered. The bell tower loomed above them, its silhouette stark against the gray sky. They pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside. The air was cold and still, carrying the faint scent of mildew and aged wood. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the floor. "This place is beautiful," Carla said, her voice echoing in the empty space. Chris nodded. "I haven't been here in years. It used to be the heart of the community." They made their way to the bell tower, climbing a narrow spiral staircase that creaked with every step. At the top, they found the bell itself, tarnished but intact, and a small wooden chest tucked into the corner. Chris knelt beside it, his hands trembling as he lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of handwritten notes, each one folded neatly. Carla picked one up and unfolded it, reading the words aloud. "Thank you for reminding me what kindness looks like." Chris reached for another note. "You gave me hope when I needed it most." The chest was filled with similar messages, each one a testament to the impact of the Christmas miracle. Carla felt a lump form in her throat as she realized what they had found. "This isn't just about your grandfather," she said. "It's about everyone in Ashwick. They've all been part of the miracle in some way." Chris nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "It's not just a tradition. It's a legacy." As they descended the bell tower and stepped back into the snowy afternoon, Carla felt a shift within herself. For the first time, she understood the true meaning of the Christmas miracle. It wasn't about uncovering a mystery or solving a puzzle. It was about connection, about the power of simple acts of kindness to transform lives. And for the first time, she felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. Chapter 7. Through the frosted window. Carla and Chris walked back from the bell tower in contemplative silence. Snow fell gently, blanketing Ashwick in a serene white. But Carla's mind churned with a storm of thoughts. The discovery in the old church had unraveled a new layer of the Christmas miracle, one that felt deeply personal yet frustratingly elusive. When they reached Chris's cabin, he invited her inside. The crackling warmth of the fireplace was a welcome reprieve from the biting cold, but Carla barely noticed it. She sat at the dining table, absent-mindedly stirring the tea Chris handed her, while her gaze fixated on the journal and the small stack of letters they'd taken from the bell tower. "You're quiet," Chris said, sitting across from her. "What's on your mind?" Carla glanced up, her expression a mix of curiosity and determination. "Your grandfather didn't just start a tradition. He started a movement. Those letters, they're proof that the miracle is about more than just one person. But I can't help wondering why it was kept hidden." Chris's brow furrowed as he considered her words. Maybe it wasn't meant to be hidden. Maybe it was meant to be discovered by the right people at the right time. Carla snorted softly, though not unkindly. "That's a romantic way of looking at it." He shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You've seen this town. People here believe in signs, in fate. My grandfather probably thought the miracle would reveal itself when it needed to." Carla tapped her fingers on the table. "That's all well and good, but if we're going to figure this out, we need more than fate. We need facts." Chris leaned back in his chair, studying her. "All right, reporter, what's your next move?" The following day, Carla made her way to the town's library, a quaint building nestled between a bakery and the general store. The smell of old books hit her as she stepped inside, and the warmth of the room wrapped around her like a blanket. Mrs. Holloway greeted her with a knowing smile. "Back so soon?" the older woman asked, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. "Can't stay away," Carla replied. "I was hoping to dig into some of Ashwick's older records. Anything related to the church or the bell tower." Mrs. Holloway's smile faltered for a moment. "That's a curious request. The old church hasn't been used in years." "I know," Carla said, "but I think it might be connected to the miracle. Chris and I found something up there yesterday. Letters from people in town. They were all thanking someone for acts of kindness." The librarian's eyes widened slightly, and she nodded. "I'll see what I can find. Give me a moment." Carla settled at a table near the window, while Mrs. Holloway disappeared into the archives. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling the world in a soft quiet. Carla's thoughts drifted to Chris, to the way his face had lit up as he read his grandfather's journal. Despite her skepticism, she couldn't deny that his belief in the miracle was infectious. Mrs. Holloway returned with a stack of dusty ledgers and bound papers. "These might have what you're looking for," she said, setting them down carefully. "Some of the records go back decades, so it'll take time to sift through them." "That's all right," Carla said. "I've got time." Hours passed as Carla pored over the records. She found references to the church's construction, mentions of community gatherings, and even a few faded photographs. But what caught her attention most were the entries about donations made to the church over the years. Many were anonymous, listed simply as "a friend." One ledger, dated nearly 30 years ago, detailed a significant contribution made just before Christmas. The amount was enough to fund repairs to the bell tower, which had been damaged in a storm. Carla's fingers traced the faded ink as she read the note scrawled in the margin. "For those who need to hear hope ring out." Her breath caught. It was a phrase lifted directly from Chris's grandfather's journal. That evening, Carla returned to Chris's cabin with the ledger tucked under her arm. He opened the door with a look of surprise and curiosity. "You've been busy," he said, stepping aside to let her in. Carla set the ledger on the table and opened it to the marked page. "I think your grandfather was behind the miracle, or at least he started it." Chris leaned over the table, his brow furrowed as he read the entry. It makes sense. He always believed in the power of giving. But why keep it a secret? "Maybe it wasn't about recognition," Carla said. "Maybe he wanted people to believe in something bigger than themselves." Chris looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and gratitude. "You're starting to sound like him." Carla chuckled softly, though the warmth in her chest took her by surprise. "Don't get used to it." As the night deepened, they sat together by the fire, piecing together the threads of the past. For the first time in years, Carla felt like she was uncovering a story that truly mattered, not just to Ashwick, but to herself. Chapter 8. The Echo of Bells. The snowstorm had abated by the time Chris and Carla sat down to a humble but delicious dinner in the warmth of the cabin. The flickering light of the fire danced across their faces, casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the world was a frozen, pristine white, but inside, there was a soft, glowing warmth that came not just from the crackling fire, but from the fragile, developing bond between them. Carla, still unsure of her feelings, focused on the meal. It was simple: roasted vegetables, a small ham, and some freshly baked bread. But in the midst of the storm, it felt like a feast. Chris had insisted on cooking, his hands moving with confidence, his easy smile making everything feel more effortless than it should have been. There was something about him, something that made the cold world outside seem far less important than the little oasis they had created in this cabin. "This is amazing," Carla said, taking a bite of the bread. "I never would have thought to use rosemary with roasted carrots." Chris chuckled, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a shared moment. "It's the little things, you know? Christmas is full of little things like that. The smells, the sounds, the warmth in your heart when you least expect it." Carla frowned slightly, not out of disdain, but because she could feel the nagging voice inside her that had kept her grounded in skepticism for so long. Christmas was about material things, wasn't it? About presents and ribbons, and the cheer people pretended to feel when the cameras were on them. She had written about these things for years, had seen behind the curtain more times than she could count. But there was something about tonight. Something in the way Chris's optimism filled the air, in the way his faith in the season was so unshakable, so innocent. It made her feel guilty. She had been so intent on exposing the so-called Christmas miracle that she hadn't allowed herself to enjoy any part of the season. And now, with him here, in this place, she could almost see it. The magic, just out of the corner of her eye. The way the world shifted just slightly when someone believed. "You really do believe in all of it, don't you?" she asked, her voice quiet. Chris nodded, his eyes serious, but soft. "I do. I think Christmas is about more than presents or decorations. It's about giving something of yourself, about finding meaning in small moments, like this one." He gestured around the cabin. "It's about remembering that there's something bigger than ourselves, something we can't always see but can always feel." Carla shifted in her seat, uncomfortable with the sincerity of his words. "So, you think, what? That a person can just will magic into existence? That's how this whole Christmas miracle thing works." He smiled gently, as though he'd known she would ask the question. "Maybe not in the way you think. Magic isn't just about sparkles or fireworks. It's about those moments when everything aligns, when a little bit of kindness makes a huge difference, when someone does something unexpected for another person, no strings attached. That's magic. That's the miracle." Her heart wavered for a moment, unsure. The way he spoke, it sounded so simple, so pure, but it was hard to reconcile that with the harshness she had seen in the world. the way people often only acted kind when there was something to gain. The idea of a selfless miracle seemed foreign, out of reach. "I get what you're saying," Carla said after a pause, her voice quieter than before. "But it's hard to believe that. Not when I've seen so much else. People don't just do nice things for no reason." Chris didn't push her, didn't argue. Instead, he simply offered a kind smile. "I understand. It takes time to believe in something bigger than what you can see. But maybe tonight, you'll see something that'll change your mind." Carla glanced at him, unsure of what he meant. But just as she was about to ask, a soft knock on the door interrupted their conversation. It was unexpected, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Who could be out there in the middle of the storm? Chris stood up slowly, walking toward the door with a quiet confidence that only deepened Carla's curiosity. He opened the door, and there, standing in the snow, was an elderly woman bundled in layers of coats, her cheeks rosy from the cold. "Excuse me," she said in a raspy voice. "I'm so sorry to bother you. I've been walking for hours and I saw your light. My car broke down a few miles back and I—" Come in, come in." Chris stepped aside to let her in, his warm demeanor instantly putting the stranger at ease. Carla watched, speechless, as Chris took the woman's coat and offered her a seat by the fire. The woman, whose name was Mrs. Kelly, looked relieved. She explained how she had been heading to visit her daughter in a nearby town, but the storm had caught her off guard, and her car had stalled. Chris immediately set about making her tea, while Carla still sat frozen, watching the scene unfold in front of her. It was so normal, so human. A simple act of kindness, offering shelter, food, warmth to a stranger. But there was something more to it, something that felt connected to the magic Chris had spoken about earlier. The atmosphere shifted slightly, the room feeling fuller, warmer, more alive. As the woman sipped her tea, she looked around the room and smiled. "You know," she said, her voice soft with emotion, "I think I'm just about ready to give up on miracles. The world's been too hard, too cold lately. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe they still exist. Maybe it's people like you who make the world brighter." Carla felt her throat tighten, her eyes burning for no reason she could pinpoint. It wasn't the woman's words, not exactly. It was the truth in them, the truth Carla had been running from. There was magic in moments like these, in the kindness that could fill a room, in the way the world felt a little less cold when people opened their hearts to each other. Mrs. Kelly left soon after, once the storm had settled enough for her to make her way back to the road. Before she left, though, she gave Chris a hug and whispered something in his ear that Carla couldn't hear. When Mrs. Kelly disappeared into the night, Chris returned to the fire, his expression thoughtful but content. Carla, still in a daze from the whole interaction, asked, "What did she say?" Chris smiled, his eyes twinkling in the dim light. "She said that the true miracle wasn't in the gift you give, but in the way you make others feel loved. She said I was part of that miracle." Carla felt a lump form in her throat. She wasn't sure what to say, but she knew this. She was starting to see what Chris had been trying to show her all along. It wasn't magic, not in the traditional sense, but it was something real, something that existed in the small, everyday miracles that people performed for each other. The storm outside had finally stopped. The night was calm, the sky clear, and for the first time in a long time, Carla found herself believing. Not in a miracle that could be quantified or explained, but in the quiet power of kindness, the kind of magic that could change the world, one small act at a time. As they sat in silence, both watching the embers fade in the fireplace, Carla glanced at Chris, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. Maybe there was more to Christmas than she had ever allowed herself to see. Maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to believe in the magic after all. Chapter 9. Trapped in the Glow. The morning light crept softly through the cabin windows, casting a gentle glow across the room. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape covered in a thick blanket of snow, the world outside a shimmering white wonderland. Carla stretched slowly, the warmth of the fire still lingering in the air. She felt more rested than she had in days, her mind clearer, though the events of the previous night continued to swirl in her thoughts like the remnants of a dream. As she pulled herself from the comfort of the blanket, she noticed Chris already up, busying himself with making breakfast. The kitchen smelled of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee, and the soft hum of a Christmas carol played in the background, filling the room with a sense of peaceful cheer. "Good morning," Chris greeted her, turning with a bright smile as she sat up. "Morning," Carla replied, rubbing her eyes. She hadn't realized how much she needed this quiet, how much she needed time to let everything sink in. Chris placed a steaming mug of coffee in front of her, the aroma rich and inviting. "I figured you might need some caffeine after all that excitement last night." Carla smiled softly, taking the mug into her hands. The warmth from the cup seeped into her skin, grounding her. She glanced out the window, the sight of the snow-covered trees and the mountains beyond creating a sense of tranquility that she hadn't known she was missing. The events of the night before, Mrs. Kelly's arrival, her story, and the kindness that had been shared in such a simple, unexpected way, had left Carla feeling unsettled. She had always prided herself on being a logical, rational person, but now, more than ever, she was finding it hard to dismiss the strange pull of something greater, something real. "You know," Carla began, her voice tentative as she looked at Chris, "I don't think I really understood what you meant about the miracle last night. But this morning, sitting here, I can't help but feel like it's all connected. Like that's the magic you were talking about." Chris set the skillet down and turned to face her, his expression warm and open. "I'm glad you're starting to see it, Carla. It's not something you can measure or explain, but it's there, in every little act of kindness. It's the heart of Christmas, the way it makes you feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself." Carla leaned back in her chair, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. I think I've been looking for something concrete, something to prove it. But maybe it's the intangible things that really matter. The moments that you can't capture with a camera or a headline." Chris nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "Exactly. You can't capture the feeling of someone offering a kind word when you're at your lowest, or the warmth that comes from helping a stranger, knowing that you've made their day a little better. That's the miracle. And it's not just about what happens on Christmas either. It's about the little miracles that happen all year round, if we're paying attention." As he spoke, Carla felt her heart soften, the skepticism that had built up over the years starting to erode. She had always been focused on the tangible, facts, stories, and headlines. But now, she was beginning to see the beauty in the things she had once dismissed. The way a simple gesture could create a ripple effect, spreading warmth and light in unexpected ways. "So, do you think the miracle really is just about kindness? Or is there something more to it?" Carla asked, her curiosity growing. Chris paused, flipping the bacon in the skillet. He thought for a moment before answering, his tone gentle yet sincere. "I think kindness is the root of it, but I also think it's about hope. The miracle is about holding on to hope, even when things feel dark or impossible. It's about finding light when everything else feels covered in shadow." Carla's chest tightened at his words. Hope. It was a concept she had long since lost faith in. Her work, her life, had always been about uncovering the truth, no matter how harsh, no matter how dark. But now, as she sat in this cozy cabin, surrounded by the warmth of a fire and the quiet comfort of Chris's company, she was starting to realize that hope wasn't something to be dismissed. It was something worth holding on to. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the occasional sizzle from the skillet. As the morning wore on, the conversation shifted, but the underlying current remained the same. The quiet acknowledgement that something had changed between them. The walls that Carla had built around herself were beginning to crumble, and in their place, something new was taking root. Something that felt soft, fragile, yet real. Just as they were finishing breakfast, there was a soft knock at the door. Carla looked at Chris in surprise, wondering who could be stopping by in the middle of a snowstorm that had only just cleared. Chris rose and opened the door, and there, standing with a basket of freshly baked bread and a jar of homemade jam, was a familiar face. One that Carla had seen around town but hadn't yet had the chance to meet. "Morning," the woman greeted with a warm smile. "I thought I'd drop by with a little something. I heard there was a new face in town and wanted to welcome you properly." Carla's heart skipped a beat. It was another act of kindness, another piece of the puzzle that was starting to form. The town wasn't just about the Christmas miracle. It was about the people who made it real, who embodied it every single day. This woman, who had no idea who Carla was or what she was doing here, had come to offer something small but meaningful. The gesture was enough to make Carla feel a sudden rush of emotion she couldn't explain. "You're too kind," Chris said, accepting the gift with a smile. "Thank you." The woman, whose name turned out to be Lucy, lingered for a moment, her eyes bright with a warmth that felt genuine. "I just wanted to make sure you knew that you're not alone here. If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to ask." As Lucy left, Carla stood in the doorway, watching her disappear into the snow. Her chest felt tight, a lump rising in her throat. She had come here to expose the town's so-called Christmas miracle, to unravel the story and prove it was all a farce. But now, with each passing moment, she was beginning to see something she hadn't expected. The miracle wasn't in some grand, flashy gesture. It was in the quiet moments, the unexpected kindness, and the sense of community that made this place, and the people in it, feel like a family. "Looks like this place has a way of surprising people," Carla murmured. Turning back to Chris, he smiled, that same knowing smile he had worn since they'd first met. "It always does. You just have to be willing to see it." As Carla stood there, looking out the window at the snow-covered landscape, she felt a shift within herself. She had come here to find the truth about the miracle, to expose the story. But now, she was beginning to realize that the story wasn't about what she could prove. It was about what she could feel. And in that moment, she felt it. The heart of the miracle, beating quietly beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. It wasn't just about kindness or hope. It was about the way people came together when they needed it most, the way the smallest actions could leave the biggest impact. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Chapter 10. Mistletoe Confessions. The snow had finally stopped falling, leaving behind a world that glittered beneath a pale winter sun. Carla stood at the cabin window, gazing out at the untouched landscape, where the trees were dusted with snow and the ground was a smooth, unbroken expanse of white. It was the kind of day that felt peaceful, almost serene. But even as she took in the beauty, there was a quiet restlessness inside her, a yearning to understand what exactly was unfolding in this small town. She had come here to unravel a mystery, to expose a carefully constructed tale about the so-called Christmas miracle. But as each day passed, her certainty had begun to waver. It wasn't just the kindness she had witnessed or the warmth of the people here. It was something deeper, something that she had been too stubborn to see before. Chris was in the kitchen, humming softly as he prepared their lunch. It had become a comfortable routine over the past few days. Mornings by the fire, shared meals, and conversations that wandered between lightheartedness and deep introspection. But today, something was different. Carla couldn't quite place it, but the air between them had shifted in a way that made her feel more connected to this place and to him than ever before. "Everything okay?" Chris asked, noticing her pensive expression as he set a plate of sandwiches down in front of her. Carla turned to face him, a small, hesitant smile tugging at her lips. I think I'm starting to get it. The whole Christmas miracle thing." Chris paused, his brow furrowing slightly as he took a seat across from her. "What do you mean?" "I came here thinking I'd be able to expose it," she admitted, her voice softer than she intended. "I thought I could prove it was all a lie, that it was just a story people told themselves to get into the holiday spirit. But now I don't know." She shook her head, unsure of how to express the jumble of thoughts in her mind. Chris's eyes softened, and he leaned back in his chair, studying her with quiet understanding. "Sometimes, the hardest thing to accept is that there's magic in the world that doesn't always make sense. It's not about proving it, Carla. It's about feeling it, about allowing yourself to believe." Carla let out a breath, a mixture of frustration and wonder creeping up inside her. "I'm not sure how to believe in something I can't see. I mean, I'm a journalist. I'm supposed to find the facts. But here, with everything that's been happening, I feel like I'm losing track of what's real." Chris smiled gently, his expression patient. "Maybe you don't need to see it to believe in it. Sometimes, the most real things are the ones you can't touch or measure, like love or hope, or the way a community comes together in a time of need. That's the miracle. And it's been here all along." Carla looked down at her sandwich, her thoughts swirling. He was right, of course. She had been so focused on finding a logical explanation, something concrete to write about, that she had missed the point entirely. The Christmas miracle wasn't about uncovering a secret or exposing a fraud. It was about the intangible, the feelings that couldn't be captured in a headline or a story. It was about something much bigger than herself. Her phone buzzed on the table, jolting her out of her thoughts. She picked it up, glancing at the screen. It was a message from her editor back home. Carla hesitated before opening it, suddenly feeling torn between the life she had left behind and the strange new world she was beginning to embrace. "Carla, we need the story. The town's Christmas miracle is already making waves. People are asking questions, and we need your take on it. Let me know when you're ready to submit." Her fingers lingered over the screen, but she didn't respond immediately. The words felt hollow now, like an echo from a past she was starting to distance herself from. What would she write? Would she still expose the town's secret? Or had her time here, her experiences with Chris and the people around her, changed her too much to go back to the old ways? As she stared at the message, Chris cleared his throat. "I know you've got a job to do, Carla, but whatever you decide, don't let it change how you feel about what's happening here. This town, this community, it's not about the press or the fame. It's about the heart of it, the real magic." Carla glanced up at him, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. He was right, of course. The story she had set out to tell was no longer the one she wanted to write. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the miracle wasn't something that could be neatly packaged into an article or an expose. It was something far more profound, something that existed in the small acts of kindness, the shared moments of connection, and the way people reached out to each other when they needed it most. "I'm not sure what to do," she said quietly, setting her phone down. "I came here to find the truth, but the truth has changed. I don't know how to write that." Chris smiled warmly, his eyes kind. "Maybe you don't need to. Maybe this story will write itself, once you let go of trying to control it." The words lingered in the air, settling over Carla like a gentle blanket. For the first time in a long time, she felt as though she could breathe freely. The pressure to explain everything, to find answers, had eased. She had spent so much of her life trying to understand the world through the lens of logic and reason. But now, she realized, there was room for something else. Something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: wonder. She picked up her coffee and took a sip, savoring the warmth. "Maybe you're right," she said softly, meeting his gaze. "Maybe I just need to let it unfold." The conversation shifted after that, moving from deep reflections to more light-hearted topics, but the feeling that lingered in the room was one of quiet contentment. It was as though they both knew that something important was happening, but neither of them needed to speak of it directly. The miracle wasn't in the air, waiting to be uncovered. It was already here, in the space between them, in the shared understanding of what it meant to truly believe. Later that afternoon, they decided to take a walk outside, to explore the town a little more. As they stepped into the crisp, cold air, Carla felt a sense of peace wash over her. The snow crunched beneath their boots, the world around them pristine and silent, as though the storm had never even happened. As they walked through the town, Carla noticed the small details she hadn't before. The decorations hanging from each door, the twinkling lights on the houses, the soft murmur of voices drifting from inside the warm homes. It was as though the whole town was wrapped in a blanket of comfort and goodwill, each person contributing in their own way to the spirit of the season. They passed the town square, where a large Christmas tree stood, its branches laden with ornaments and lights. In front of it, a small group of people had gathered, some singing carols, others simply standing and enjoying the moment. It wasn't a grand spectacle, but there was a beauty in its simplicity, in the way the town had come together, united by something larger than themselves. Carla stopped for a moment, watching the scene unfold before her. The warmth in her chest grew, spreading outwards, and for the first time, she understood. This was the miracle. The way people cared for one another, how they came together even in difficult times, how they found joy in the small moments. It was a miracle that couldn't be explained, but it didn't need to be. As she turned to Chris, she found him watching her with a knowing smile. "I think you're beginning to see it," he said quietly. Carla nodded, feeling a quiet certainty settle within her. "I think I am." And in that moment, she realized that the Christmas miracle wasn't something that could be written about or captured in a single story. It was something that lived in every act of kindness, in every smile shared, and in every person who believed in the magic of the season. It was something real, and something worth believing in. Chapter 11. Footprints in the Snow. The days after their walk in the town square seemed to stretch before Carla like a peaceful, unfolding story. Each morning, she woke up with a lightness in her chest, the heavy burden of skepticism she had carried for years slowly lifting. The town was blanketed in a sense of calm that felt almost magical. And yet, it wasn't the decorations, the lights, or the carols that defined it. It was the people, the quiet, steady belief they all shared in something larger than themselves. Carla wasn't sure when exactly the change had happened, but she had begun to let go of the story she thought she needed to tell. She was no longer obsessed with unmasking the Christmas miracle as a mere tourist trap or a local gimmick. Instead, she found herself more focused on understanding it, feeling it, living it. The morning sun streamed through the cabin windows, casting long shadows on the wooden floor. Chris was already up, preparing breakfast as usual. The smell of fresh pancakes and coffee filled the air, mixing with the familiar scent of pine from the tree they had decorated together the night before. Carla sat at the table, sipping her coffee, her gaze drifting to the small pile of notes she had taken over the past few days. They weren't the hard-hitting, fact-based journalistic notes she had once taken in the rush of interviews and investigations. These were different. They were observations, reflections, little snippets of thoughts that captured moments. The way people spoke to each other, the kindness in their gestures, the quiet joy that seemed to infuse everything they did. She had intended to write an article that exposed the town's so-called miracle, but now, As she looked at the notes before her, she realized that the only story she could write was her own. She could no longer separate herself from the experience, could no longer maintain the cold distance she had once thought was necessary. This was no longer about facts. It was about truth. The truth of the people, the truth of the place, and the truth of the love that seemed to radiate from every corner of the town. "Are you planning to work today?" Chris asked, his voice breaking into her thoughts. He placed a plate of pancakes in front of her, along with a small bowl of syrup and fresh berries. Carla smiled at him, her heart warmed by the gesture. She had come to realize just how much she appreciated these quiet mornings with him. "I think today, I'm going to just be," she said, pushing her notes aside. "I don't think I need to write anymore." Chris raised an eyebrow, a playful smile tugging at his lips. "No article on the Christmas miracle?" She shook her head. "No, I think I found something better than a story. I found a reason to believe." Chris sat down across from her, his expression softening. "I think that's the best thing you could have found." The words lingered between them, heavy with meaning. Carla had spent so long searching for answers, trying to capture the essence of the miracle in a way that could be understood, measured, and explained. But now, she understood something far more important. The miracle was not something to be understood. It was something to be felt. It was the warmth of a shared meal, the kindness of a stranger, the way people came together in ways that didn't need to be justified or labeled. It was a feeling, a quiet certainty that no amount of writing could fully capture. After breakfast, they decided to take a walk to the town's small park. The streets were quiet, the only sounds the crunch of their boots on the fresh snow and the occasional distant laughter from children playing nearby. Carla could feel the town around her, its heartbeat steady and strong, as though it had always been this way, full of quiet generosity and unspoken bonds. As they walked, they passed by a small group of volunteers setting up for the town's Christmas Eve celebration. The community had come together to prepare for the evening's festivities, and there was a palpable sense of excitement in the air. People greeted each other with warm smiles and easy laughter, exchanging pleasantries as they worked together to string lights and decorate the square. There was no hurry, no frantic rush to get everything perfect. It was as though the entire town had agreed that the best way to celebrate the season was simply to be present, to share in the joy of the moment. Carla felt a tug at her heart as she watched them. This wasn't a performance. This was real. It was the heart of the town, beating in unison, fueled by something far greater than any of them could fully articulate. And as she stood there, watching the people she had once viewed as part of a story to be uncovered, she realized she was no longer an outsider. She was part of it now, part of the miracle. "I think this is what you meant," Carla said softly, turning to Chris. "It's not about the big gestures. It's about the small moments, the things we do without thinking. That's what makes it real." Chris smiled at her, his eyes warm. "Exactly. It's about the little things that add up to something big. That's where the miracle lives." As the day wore on, the town's preparations continued. People gathered in the square, setting up food stalls and hanging wreaths on every door. The smell of roasted chestnuts and cinnamon filled the air, mingling with the scent of pine from the decorated trees. Music played softly from speakers as families arrived, their faces glowing with anticipation. Carla and Chris found a spot near the fire pit, where people were gathered, laughing and talking as they warmed their hands by the crackling flames. Carla felt a sense of peace settle over her as she watched the town come alive. There was a unity here that she had never experienced before. An unspoken understanding that this was a time for coming together, for embracing the magic of the season, not because it had to be perfect, but because it was real and it was worth celebrating. As the evening drew near, the first snowflakes of the evening began to fall, gently drifting down from the sky like tiny stars. The lights in the square twinkled even brighter as the darkness settled in, casting a soft glow over the scene. People gathered in front of the Christmas tree, their faces illuminated by the colorful lights, their voices singing along to the carols. The energy was contagious, and Carla couldn't help but smile, caught up in the warmth of the moment. "You know," Carla said, her voice almost lost in the music, "I think I understand now. The miracle isn't just about what happens on Christmas Eve. It's about what happens every day. It's about the people who make it real." Chris looked at her, his expression soft with understanding. "Exactly. The miracle is always here. It's just a matter of seeing it." As the carols played on, Carla felt the weight of the past few days settle into something she could finally understand. She had come here to find a story, to uncover a secret, but what she had found instead was something far more valuable, a reminder of what truly mattered. And as she stood there, surrounded by the warmth of the community, the love of the people, and the quiet joy of the season, Carla knew that she had found the greatest miracle of all. It wasn't just the Christmas lights or the snowflakes falling from the sky. It was the way people cared for each other, the way they came together to create something beautiful, something real. And in that moment, she realized that perhaps this was the miracle she had been searching for all along. Chapter 12. A Heart Unwrapped. The night was quiet, save for the soft rustle of the wind and the distant hum of music from the town square. Carla sat on the porch of the cabin, wrapped in a thick blanket, staring out into the darkened forest that lay beyond the town. The sky above was a deep indigo, the stars sparkling like tiny diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth. It was a perfect night, the kind that made everything feel still, as though the world was holding its breath. Chris had gone back to town to help with the final preparations for the Christmas Eve celebration, but Carla had decided to stay behind for a while. There was something about the solitude that she needed, a moment to reflect on everything that had changed since she first arrived in this little town. The miracle that had once seemed so elusive, so impossible, was now something she felt with every fiber of her being. It wasn't just a story. It was a truth she had come to understand in a way that words couldn't quite capture. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cold air brush against her face, feeling the quiet peace that had settled over her. The past few days had been a whirlwind of new experiences, new perspectives, and the kind of warmth she hadn't known she needed. The doubts, the skepticism, the need for proof. It had all faded, replaced by something more profound. She had stopped looking for answers and had started feeling the magic that everyone else had known all along. When she opened her eyes again, she was startled to see a figure approaching from the path leading to the cabin. She squinted against the darkness, recognizing Chris's silhouette as he neared. "You're back early," she called out, standing up from her seat, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Chris smiled as he stepped onto the porch, his cheeks rosy from the cold. "I thought you might need some company. It's a beautiful night." Carla nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "It is. The sky looks like something out of a dream." He glanced up at the stars, his expression soft. "It's like the world slows down on nights like this. Everything seems clearer." Carla smiled at his words, realizing how true they were. Tonight felt different. There was a stillness in the air, a quiet that felt almost sacred. It was as if the entire world was taking a pause, waiting for something to unfold. "I was thinking," Carla began, as Chris settled beside her on the porch swing, "about how different things are now. When I first came here, I was so focused on finding the truth, the reason behind the Christmas miracle. I thought it would be something tangible, something I could prove, something I could report on." Chris listened quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He didn't interrupt, knowing she needed to process everything herself. "But now," Carla continued, "I see it differently. The miracle, It's not something to be proven. It's something you have to feel. It's the way people here care for each other. It's the way they come together in times of need and even in times of joy. It's the little things, Chris. The smiles, the shared meals, the way everyone looks out for each other. She paused, looking out into the distance as if searching for words that might capture everything she felt. I think I was looking for something more grand, something that could be explained. But what I've found is that sometimes the most meaningful things can't be explained. They just are. Chris reached over, his hand gently brushing against hers. The simple touch sent a ripple of warmth through her, a reminder of the bond they had formed over the past days. "You figured it out," he said softly, his voice rich with understanding. "The Christmas miracle isn't just about the town or the people. It's about the heart of it all. It's about the love that's woven into everything, even the smallest actions." Carla nodded, her heart swelling with a quiet kind of gratitude. She had come here with one goal in mind, but in the process, she had found something far more precious. She had found a community, a sense of belonging, and, perhaps most importantly, a deeper understanding of herself. The miracle had never been about the grand gestures or the perfect holiday. It was about the moments in between. It was about how people showed up for each other, even when it wasn't easy. A soft gust of wind rustled the trees, and for a brief moment, the only sound was the creaking of the porch swing as they both sat in comfortable silence. It was a silence that didn't feel awkward or forced, but rather filled with a shared sense of peace. "I've been thinking about my story," Carla said after a while, breaking the silence, "and about what I want to write. When I first got here, I thought it would be an expose. I wanted to uncover something, prove it was all a facade. But now, I don't think that's what I should do. I don't think this town needs an expose." Chris turned to face her, his expression open, waiting for her to continue. "I've spent so much of my career looking for the truth," she said slowly, "but I've been so focused on finding answers that I've missed what's right in front of me. I've missed the real story. The way people show up for each other. The way they care without asking for anything in return." She took a deep breath, her gaze meeting his. "I think the story I want to write is about the miracle of the everyday. About the kindness that exists here, in this town, and how it has changed me. I don't need to prove anything anymore. I just want to share it." Chris smiled, his eyes bright with warmth. "I think that's the best story you could write. The truth you found is the real Christmas miracle." Carla smiled back, feeling a deep sense of relief wash over her. She had finally found the clarity she had been seeking. It wasn't about uncovering some hidden truth. It was about embracing what was already there, right in front of her. The miracle wasn't something that needed to be uncovered or explained. It was something that needed to be experienced, felt, and shared. The night stretched on, the stars overhead twinkling like 1,000 tiny promises. The town, still bustling with preparations, felt alive with anticipation for the evening's celebration. Carla and Chris sat together on the porch, the quiet of the night wrapping around them like a blanket. The Christmas miracle wasn't something that could be defined or contained. It was a living, breathing part of the world, a part of the people, of the moments they shared, of the love they gave without expecting anything in return. It was in every greeting, every smile, every simple act of kindness. And as Carla sat there, watching the stars above and feeling the warmth of Chris beside her, she realized that the greatest miracle of all was the one she had found in herself, the ability to believe again, to believe in the goodness of others, in the magic of the season, and in the quiet miracles that could change a life. Chapter 13. The Gift of Truth. The snow had fallen steadily throughout the day, and by the time evening approached, the town square was blanketed in a pristine layer of white. The lights from the Christmas tree twinkled against the backdrop of the darkened sky, casting a soft glow over the gathering crowd. Carla stood at the edge of the square, her heart beating with anticipation as she watched people filter in from every direction, bundled in scarves and mittens, laughing and chatting as they made their way toward the center of town. It had been a long day of preparation, but now, as the evening finally unfolded, everything seemed to come together in a way that felt almost magical. The air was crisp and cold, but there was warmth in every smile, in every friendly greeting that passed between the townspeople. The energy was infectious, and Carla could feel herself being swept up in the excitement. The quiet wonder of the Christmas season, the same wonder she had witnessed over the past few days, was alive in every person who gathered here. Chris stood beside her, his presence a steady comfort. She glanced at him, a smile tugging at her lips. He had been her guide through this transformation, showing her how to see things with new eyes. His belief in the magic of Christmas had rubbed off on her in ways she hadn't expected. She wasn't just an observer anymore. She was a part of this moment, a part of something bigger than herself. "Ready for the celebration?" Chris asked, his voice full of warmth. Carla nodded, her eyes scanning the square. She had never seen a town so alive with such genuine joy. It wasn't just the lights or the decorations, it was the people. There was a sense of belonging here that made everything else fade into the background. No one was trying to outdo anyone else. No one was chasing perfection. They were all here to share in the spirit of the season, and it was something that couldn't be replicated or bought. It was something that could only be felt. "I'm ready," Carla said softly. "I think I finally get it. I see now what makes this town's miracle so special." Chris smiled, his eyes warm with understanding. "It's not about the things we do or the way we celebrate. It's about the heart behind it all. The miracle is in the way people come together, the way they care for each other without expecting anything in return." Carla's heart swelled at his words. She had spent so much time focusing on what she thought she should find, on the story she thought she was supposed to tell. But now, standing here with Chris, she realized that the real story was the one she had been living all along. The miracle wasn't in the grand gestures. It was in the everyday acts of kindness, in the way people gave of themselves, in the way love and hope weaved through the fabric of this small town. As the evening continued, the square filled with families, friends, and neighbors, all gathered in celebration. The smell of roasted chestnuts and cinnamon filled the air, mingling with the sound of laughter and music. Children ran around, their faces painted with excitement as they waited for the annual Christmas Eve procession to begin. Carla and Chris found a spot near the fire pit where people had gathered to share stories and songs. The warmth from the fire wrapped around them like a blanket, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. It was as though the world had paused just for them, and they were suspended in a moment of quiet beauty. As the town's bell tower rang, signaling the start of the procession, the crowd fell silent. The air seemed to hold its breath as everyone gathered closer to the town square, waiting for the arrival of the Christmas Eve guests. Carla watched as the first group of carolers appeared, their voices rising in harmony, carrying the familiar songs of the season. The sound was rich and full, a reminder of the simple joys that Christmas brought. The carolers were followed by a small group of volunteers carrying baskets filled with food and gifts for those in need. It was a tradition in the town to make sure that no one was left out of the celebration, that everyone, no matter their circumstances, had a place at the table. Carla's heart ached as she watched the volunteers, the selflessness of their actions so raw, so pure. It wasn't just the physical gifts they carried. It was the gift of time, of love, of sharing what they had with others. As the procession continued, the crowd joined in, singing along to the carols and sharing in the joy that was palpable in the air. Carla looked around, taking in the faces of the people she had come to know over the past week. There was no pretension here, no need to impress. Everyone was simply there, present, sharing in the miracle of the season together. And then, as if by some unspoken cue, the moment arrived. The townspeople gathered around the Christmas tree, their faces glowing in the light of the fire and the stars above. The music quieted, and a hush fell over the crowd. Carla stood beside Chris, her breath catching in her throat as the mayor stepped forward, a gentle smile on his face. He spoke softly, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Every year, we gather here to celebrate the Christmas miracle," the mayor said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "But this year, I think we can all agree that the real miracle is not in the gifts we give or the things we receive. It is in the love we share, the way we come together, and the way we care for each other." The crowd nodded, murmuring in agreement. Carla felt a lump form in her throat as she listened to the mayor's words. It was the truth she had discovered over the past few days, a truth that had moved her in ways she never expected. The mayor raised his hand, signaling for everyone to join in the final song of the evening. The sound of Silent Night filled the air, the familiar melody echoing through the square. As the townspeople sang, their voices blended together in perfect harmony, a symbol of the unity that bound them all. Carla's voice joined with theirs, her heart swelling with emotion as she sang. For the first time in a long time, she felt a deep sense of peace. The miracle wasn't something that could be captured or explained. It was something that could only be experienced, felt in the quiet moments, in the love that surrounded her. As the final notes of the song faded into the night, the crowd erupted into applause. The mayor smiled, his eyes bright with pride. "Merry Christmas, everyone," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "Merry Christmas." The crowd responded in unison, their voices carrying into the night. Carla looked at Chris, her heart full. The miracle wasn't in the presents or the lights or the grand celebrations. It was in the way the town had come together, in the way they shared their love, their hope, their joy with each other. It was in the simple, everyday acts of kindness that made this town and this Christmas so special. As she stood there, surrounded by the warmth of the people she had come to love, Carla realized that she had found her own miracle. She had found a place where she truly belonged, a place where the magic of Christmas was alive in every heart. And in that moment, she knew that she would carry the spirit of this Christmas with her forever, a reminder that the greatest miracles were the ones that couldn't be explained, only felt. Chapter 14. Broken Ornaments. The night after Christmas Eve was quiet, but in the best possible way. The townspeople had returned to their homes after the celebration, carrying with them the warmth of shared joy and the soft glow of the miracle they had witnessed together. The snow had stopped falling, and the sky was clear, the stars scattered like glittering jewels against the dark canvas of the universe. It was a night for reflection, for quiet gratitude, and for dreams that seemed to linger in the air long after the final notes of the carols had faded. Carla stood at the window of the small cabin, looking out into the vast expanse of snow-covered land that stretched beyond the town. She was alone, but not in the same way she had been before. There was a sense of peace in the silence now, a stillness that felt like home. The bustle of the town, the laughter, the sense of unity. It all felt like a distant dream, a beautiful dream she never wanted to wake from. She turned away from the window, her gaze falling on the Christmas tree that still stood in the corner of the room. The soft glow of the lights flickered in the dimness, casting long shadows across the walls. Beneath the tree, the gifts that had been exchanged the night before sat untouched, wrapped in colorful paper and tied with delicate ribbons. But it wasn't the gifts that drew her attention. It was the feeling of the room itself, the warmth, the love, the sense that something beautiful had unfolded here, something beyond what could be wrapped in paper. Chris had left earlier that morning, promising to return after he finished his chores in the town. Carla hadn't expected him to be gone for long, but in the quiet of the cabin, it felt like hours had passed. She couldn't quite explain the restlessness in her chest, the way her thoughts seemed to race even in the stillness. She knew that something had shifted inside her, something deeper than the understanding of the town's miracle. Something about this place, this time, and especially Chris, had made her realize how much she had been missing before. She had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to stand alone. But now, with the warmth of the Christmas season still hanging in the air, she found herself craving connection in ways she hadn't anticipated. The door creaked open, and Chris stepped inside. His cheeks flushed from the cold. He removed his coat and shook the snow off his boots, his presence filling the room with an undeniable warmth. He smiled as he looked around, his eyes catching the glow of the tree. "It's beautiful," he said softly, his voice full of wonder. He looked at Carla, a quiet tenderness in his gaze. "This whole place feels different now, doesn't it?" Carla nodded, the words catching in her throat. "It does. It's like everything has settled into place. Like this. This is where I'm supposed to be." Chris took a few steps toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm glad you're here," he said, his voice low and sincere. "This town wouldn't be the same without you." The simplicity of his words struck Carla in a way she hadn't expected. She had come to the town with one goal in mind, to uncover the truth about the Christmas miracle. But now, standing here in the quiet glow of the cabin, she realized that she had found something far more important than the story she had intended to write. She had found something that no article could capture, no headline could sum up. She had found a place where she felt seen, understood, and, most importantly, needed. "I've been thinking a lot," Carla said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "About why I came here in the first place, about what I was really looking for." Chris tilted his head slightly, his gaze curious. "When I first arrived, I thought I was just looking for a story," she continued. "I thought I could prove that the miracle wasn't real, that it was all just a fabrication. But now I see that I was looking for something else, something deeper." Chris took a step closer, his eyes soft with understanding. "I think what I was really looking for," Carla went on, "was a sense of belonging. A place where I could just be, without all the expectations and the pressure to have everything figured out. I've spent so much of my life trying to prove something to myself and to the world. But here, I feel like I'm enough just as I am." Chris smiled warmly, his expression full of affection. "You're more than enough," he said, his voice gentle. "You've brought something here that no one else could. Your perspective, your curiosity, your willingness to open your heart even when it's hard. That's what makes you so special, Carla." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, and for a moment, she struggled to hold them back. She had spent so many years burying her emotions, hiding behind her cynicism and skepticism, thinking that if she didn't care too much, she wouldn't get hurt. But here, in this little town, surrounded by people who cared for each other without hesitation, she had learned to let down her guard. She had learned that it was okay to be vulnerable, to admit that she needed connection, that she needed love. "I don't know what's going to happen when I leave," Carla said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "But I do know that this place has changed me, and I don't think I can ever go back to the way I was before." Chris reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away a tear that had escaped. "You don't have to go back," he said softly. "You're already home." The words settled over her like a warm embrace, wrapping her in a sense of belonging that she hadn't known she needed until now. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to fully feel the truth of his words. She wasn't just in the right place at the right time. She had found the place where her heart could finally rest. When she opened her eyes again, Chris was still standing before her, his gaze filled with a quiet intensity. There was no need for words anymore, no need for explanations or justifications. They both understood what was happening, what had been happening between them all along. Carla stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and without a word, she wrapped her arms around him, pressing her cheek against his chest. The warmth of his embrace enveloped her, grounding her in the moment, in the certainty that this was where she belonged. She had found her home, not in a place, but in the people, in the love that she had opened herself up to. In Chris, for the first time in a long time, Carla let herself be vulnerable, let herself be loved. And in that moment, she understood that the Christmas miracle was not just about magic or grand gestures. It was about finding the people who saw you for who you truly were and accepting their love with an open heart. As she stood there in Chris's arms, the world outside quiet and still, she realized that the miracle was not something to be found. It was something to be given, to be shared, and to be embraced. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she had truly received it. Chapter 15. Stitches of Light. The days following Christmas were a quiet kind of magic. The town settled back into its usual rhythm, the afterglow of the holiday lingering in the hearts of everyone who had participated in the celebration. The streets were still lined with twinkling lights, and the smell of pine and cinnamon seemed to cling to the air like a fond memory. The Christmas miracle had come and gone, but its presence remained, woven into the fabric of the town and its people. For Carla, the days felt different now. They felt slower, more purposeful, as if the ticking of time had found a new pace, one that allowed for reflection, for moments of connection, for the things she had once overlooked. The town had become a part of her in ways she couldn't have imagined. It wasn't just the beauty of the place or the charm of the traditions. It was the people. It was the way they had welcomed her, shown her the depth of their kindness, and allowed her to find something she hadn't known she was searching for. Chris had been a steady presence, his kindness and warmth wrapping around her like a comforting blanket. He was there in the quiet moments when she needed someone to talk to, and in the stillness when she simply needed to be. It was as if, together, they were writing a story that neither of them had expected, one that was unfolding slowly, like the pages of a book they were discovering for the first time. But even with the peace that had settled over her heart, there was still a question lingering in Carla's mind. What happened next? What did this new chapter of her life look like? It had been so easy to imagine her life in black and white terms, as though everything could be defined by facts and logic, by things she could understand and control. But now, the world seemed so much bigger, so much more complicated, and she wasn't sure where she fit into it anymore. It was a quiet morning, the sun shining weakly through the windows, when Chris knocked on the door of the cabin. Carla had been sitting at the small table by the window, staring out at the snow, lost in thought. The sound of the knock pulled her from her reverie, and she stood up quickly to answer. She found Chris standing on the doorstep, holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Mornin'," he said with a grin, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Thought you might like a little something." Carla raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "What's this?" "A gift," he replied simply, offering it to her with a warm smile. "I figured it was time for you to have something to remember this Christmas by. A token of, well, everything." She took the package from him, her fingers brushing his for a moment, a simple touch that felt more significant than it might have before. "You really didn't have to," she said, though she couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. "I wanted to," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "I think it's time we stop pretending like we don't deserve the good things that come our way." Carla turned the small package over in her hands, feeling the weight of it. She could sense that this wasn't just any gift. It was more than a simple gesture. It was something that marked a turning point, something that would symbolize what she had found here, in this town, with him. "Come on inside," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I'm curious now." Chris stepped into the cabin, his boots leaving a trail of snow on the floor. Carla led him to the small living area, where she took a seat on the couch and carefully began to unwrap the package. As the paper came away, she revealed a small wooden box, intricately carved with delicate patterns. She traced her fingers over the smooth surface, admiring the craftsmanship. "It's beautiful," she said softly, her voice filled with awe. Chris smiled, sitting down beside her. "Open it." Carla lifted the lid of the box, and inside, nestled on a bed of soft fabric, was a silver pendant in the shape of a heart. It was simple but elegant, its edges gently curved, and as she picked it up, she felt an inexplicable sense of connection to it. It was as if it held a piece of the town, of everything she had experienced here, of everything she had learned about love and belonging. "Chris," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "this is too much. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he said, his gaze never leaving her. "I just thought it might help you remember that you're not alone, no matter where you go." The words hit her like a wave, and for a moment, she felt as though everything in her life had led to this moment. She had spent so long running from connection, from the vulnerability that came with it, and now, sitting here with Chris, she understood the truth. It wasn't the Christmas miracle that had changed her. It was the love and the community that had enveloped her, the simple but profound act of belonging. Tears welled in her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away, embarrassed. "You really do know how to make someone feel special, don't you?" Chris chuckled softly. "It's not about the gift, Carla. It's about the way we've made each other feel, the way we've shared this time together. I think we both needed this in more ways than one." Carla nodded, her heart full. She had spent so many years searching for something she thought was outside of herself, but now she realized that it had always been right here, waiting to be discovered. "Thank you," she said quietly, placing the pendant around her neck and feeling its weight settle against her skin. "This means more than you know." Chris leaned back on the couch, his arm resting casually across the back. "It's only just the beginning, Carla. We've still got a lot of life to live, a lot of memories to make. But now we know what really matters." Carla looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. She didn't know what the future held, but in this moment, she knew she didn't have to have all the answers. She didn't have to plan every step of the journey, because, for the first time, she had the faith to simply let things unfold, to trust that whatever came next would be just as beautiful as what she had already experienced. As they sat there together, the warmth of the fire crackling softly in the background, Carla realized that this was the true miracle of Christmas. The gift of love, of connection, and the unspoken promise that, no matter where life took them, they would always find their way back to each other. And that was enough. More than enough. Chapter 16. The Miracle Beneath the Ice. The town had returned to its usual pace. The holiday magic had settled into memories, leaving behind a lingering warmth that seemed to infuse every corner of the small village. The snow still dusted the ground, but it no longer felt like a blanket of isolation. Now, it felt like a promise, like something beautiful had been woven into the fabric of the town that would remain long after the season had passed. For Carla, it was a time of quiet reflection. She had been here long enough now to know that this place, this town, wasn't just a backdrop to a story she was telling. It was a part of her own story. The simple truth that had eluded her for so long had become clear. The Christmas miracle wasn't just an event or a tradition. It was the heart of this place. It was the people, the community, the way they saw each other, supported each other, and cared for each other without hesitation. It was something Carla had never really understood before, not fully. But now, with Chris by her side and the warmth of the town surrounding her, she realized that the greatest miracle was the human capacity for love and connection. And it was in that realization that she found her own place in the world. The journey she had started so skeptically, with the intent to uncover the truth, had led her here, to a truth far more profound than anything she could have expected. The days after Christmas passed quietly. Carla found herself slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming a part of the rhythm of the town. She began to take long walks through the snow-covered streets, breathing in the crisp winter air and exchanging greetings with the locals who had come to know her. She found comfort in the familiar faces, in the small interactions that now felt like a thread weaving her deeper into the fabric of this place. And then there was Chris. He had become a constant in her life, in the best possible way. Their connection, so simple yet so powerful, grew stronger with each passing day. It was a partnership built on mutual respect, on a shared understanding that neither of them needed to be perfect, but they could be together, and that was enough. It was late one afternoon when Carla sat at the same table by the window, watching the shadows stretch across the snow-covered ground. She had come to a decision. It wasn't one she had arrived at easily, but it was one she knew she had to make. She had been offered a job back in the city, a prestigious position at the magazine she had worked for before, one that would take her away from this town, away from Chris, and away from the life she had begun to build here. It was an opportunity, no doubt, one that many people would envy. But as she sat there, contemplating the offer, the reality of it settled in her chest like a weight. She had learned so much during her time here. About love, about belonging, about the things that truly mattered. And she couldn't help but wonder if the life she had once pursued was the life she still wanted. She had spent so many years chasing stories, trying to uncover the truth, but now she realized that the truth wasn't something to be uncovered. It was something to be lived. Just as she was lost in thought, the door creaked open, and Chris stepped inside, his face flushed from the cold. He smiled at her, a quiet warmth in his eyes, and walked over to where she sat. He didn't ask what she was thinking, didn't press her for anything. He simply sat down beside her, his presence steady and comforting. "Thinking about the future?" he asked quietly, his voice soft, almost as though he already knew the answer. Carla looked at him, her heart racing slightly as she considered her next words. "I've been offered a job," she said, her voice trembling just a little. "Back in the city. It's a great opportunity, something I've worked for my whole career. But," she trailed off, not knowing how to finish the sentence. She wanted to say so much, about how everything had changed, how this town had changed her, how Chris had changed her. But the words felt inadequate, like they couldn't possibly capture what she was feeling. Chris watched her, his expression thoughtful but patient. "But it doesn't feel right," he said, finishing her sentence for her. "You've changed, Carla, and I can see it in your eyes. I think you know what you need to do." Carla exhaled slowly, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision. She had always prided herself on being able to make clear, logical choices, but this one was different. This one wasn't about facts or figures. It was about a feeling of belonging, of finding something that was more important than any job, any article, any career. "I don't want to leave," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I don't want to leave you, and I don't want to leave this place. I've spent so much of my life running, trying to outrun feelings, trying to outrun the things I was too afraid to face. But now I realize that what I've been running from isn't something I want to escape anymore. It's something I want to embrace." Chris reached out, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, reassuring, as if telling her that everything would be okay. "You don't have to leave," he said simply. "You don't have to choose between the life you had and the life you're building now. You can have both if you want." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Carla felt as though the world had shifted beneath her feet. She had been so afraid of change, of making the wrong decision, but now she realized that there wasn't a wrong choice. There was only the path forward, whatever it looked like, whatever it involved. "I want to stay," she said finally, her voice steady and sure. "I want to stay here with you, and I want to be a part of this town, of this community. I want to write stories that matter, stories that are real. I don't need to be in the city to do that." Chris smiled, his eyes shining with pride. "Then stay," he said softly. "We'll make this work together." And in that moment, everything felt clear. Carla had spent so much time looking for answers, trying to figure out what she was supposed to do with her life. But now, she understood. The answers weren't out there somewhere. They were inside her, waiting to be discovered when she allowed herself to embrace what truly mattered. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden light over the snow-covered land, Carla knew that she had made the right choice. She was home, in every sense of the word. And whatever the future held, she was ready for it. With Chris by her side, with the town that had welcomed her, and with a heart full of love and belonging, she knew she was finally exactly where she was meant to be. The Christmas miracle had shown her the truth, and now it was time to live it. Chapter 17. Snowfalls Embrace. The early months of the year drifted by like the slow melting of winter snow, as if the world itself was still adjusting to the warmth that had arrived in the wake of Christmas. For Carla, each day felt like a continuation of the journey she had started in this small town, a town that had become her home in ways she hadn't known she was looking for. She had made her decision to stay, to embrace this new life that was unfolding before her. And while she had no illusions that everything would be perfect, she felt a quiet sense of peace that came from knowing she was no longer running from something, but walking towards something. A future she was choosing, with all its uncertainties and promises. Chris had been her steady companion through the days that followed, their bond growing deeper with each passing moment. They shared laughter, quiet conversations, and the comfort of simple routines that slowly wove their lives together. She had seen a side of him she hadn't noticed before, a man who was as thoughtful and caring as he was strong, a man who believed in the power of love and community in ways that inspired her to look beyond her own fears. But while Carla had found peace in her decision, there was still an ache deep within her. It was the realization that her past, the life she had left behind, was never truly gone. She couldn't fully erase the memories of her career, of the city, of the life that had shaped her. The job offer she had turned down still lingered in the back of her mind, an echo of what could have been. Carla often found herself walking alone through the streets of the town, reflecting on all that had happened. The snow had long since melted, leaving behind the bare bones of winter. The days were longer now, and the warmth of spring was just beginning to show itself in the form of budding flowers and soft breezes. The town, too, was in transition. People were returning to their daily routines after the holiday season. The town square no longer crowded with tourists, but still holding onto the charm that made it unique. She had come to understand something important during those walks, something that had eluded her for so long. The town wasn't perfect. The people weren't perfect, but it was real. It was life in all its messy, complicated glory. And in a world that often felt too fast, too impersonal, there was something deeply comforting about that reality. But Carla still wasn't sure what the future held for her. There was so much more to explore, to learn. She had started writing again, but the stories she told were different now. They weren't the investigative pieces she used to churn out for the magazine. They were stories of the people she had met here, stories that captured the warmth of small moments and the quiet beauty of everyday life. They were personal stories, stories of connection, of love, and of community. Stories that didn't need to be sensational to matter. It was on one of these walks, as spring began to bloom in the air, that Carla found herself standing outside the small community center at the edge of town. She had passed it many times before, but today, something about it caught her attention. There were people gathered around, laughing and talking, setting up tables for an event. Chris appeared beside her, having come up quietly behind her. "Thought you might be interested in what's going on over here," he said, his voice light. Carla turned to him, a smile forming on her lips. "I'm intrigued. What's this?" He nodded toward the people who were setting up the event. "It's a spring festival. It's something the town does every year to celebrate the end of the long winter. We all pitch in. Games, food, music. It's a big deal." Carla watched them, a sense of warmth bubbling inside her. "I've never seen a festival quite like this. It's beautiful. So much life." Chris grinned, looking proud. "Yeah, it's one of the things that makes this place so special. People come together for something bigger than themselves. And it's not just about fun. It's about helping each other out. Everyone plays a part." She looked at him, her heart swelling with affection. "That sounds perfect. Want to help out?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "I'm sure they could use another pair of hands." Without hesitation, Carla nodded. "I'd love to." And so, over the course of the next few hours, Carla found herself immersed in the bustling preparations for the festival. She helped set up tables, decorated with bright colors, and even pitched in to prepare some of the food. As the afternoon wore on, the air filled with laughter and music, with the sense that something magical was taking place right before her eyes. Carla marveled at how easy it was to feel a part of this community. The people she had once viewed from a distance now felt like family, each person contributing in their own way to make the festival a success. There was an authenticity in the way they worked together, a joy that came from simply being present and offering what they had to give. As the sun began to set, casting a soft glow over the town, the festival came alive in full force. People gathered in the square, eating, dancing, and celebrating the arrival of spring. The music was loud, the food delicious, and the laughter infectious. It was a night of joy, of connection, and of living in the moment. Carla stood beside Chris, watching the festivities unfold, a deep sense of contentment filling her chest. She could feel the pulse of the town in her bones now, the rhythm of life that was so different from the hurried pace of the city. There was no rush here, no need to be somewhere else, to be anyone else. It was a place where people were allowed to simply be, and that, she realized, was the greatest gift of all. "Are you happy?" Chris asked quietly, turning to her with a smile. Carla nodded, her eyes shining in the fading light. "I am. I never thought I could find happiness in a place like this, but it's more than I ever could have hoped for. More than I ever knew I needed." Chris took her hand, his touch warm against her skin. "I'm glad you stayed. I knew you would find it here. You belong." Carla squeezed his hand gently, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She had finally found her place, and she wasn't going anywhere. The road ahead was still uncertain, full of twists and turns, but with Chris by her side and the town supporting her, she knew she could face anything that came her way. The night stretched on, and the festival continued into the darkness. Carla and Chris danced together beneath the stars, surrounded by the people who had become her family. The Christmas miracle had led her here, but it was the love, the connection, and the sense of belonging that had truly changed her life. And as the music played and the laughter echoed through the night, Carla knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with possibility, with love, and with the quiet miracle of being home. Chapter 18. The Eternal Spark. As the days of spring continued to unfold, the small town seemed to awaken along with the earth. Flowers bloomed in vibrant colors, the air turned soft and warm, and the laughter of children echoed through the streets. It was a season of growth, of renewal, and Carla couldn't help but feel the transformation within herself mirrored in the world around her. She had found a place here, within the town, within her own heart and alongside Chris. And now, more than ever, she was ready to embrace whatever came next. But there were still moments when Carla couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something. Something unknown, something important. She knew that change wasn't just something that happened to you. Sometimes, it was something you chose. And for all the joy and peace she had found here, there were questions she had yet to answer. Chris, ever steady and supportive, had sensed her restlessness. He never asked her to explain anything she wasn't ready to, but he was there for her, a quiet presence beside her as she navigated her thoughts. It had become clear to her that the love they shared was grounded in mutual respect, in the understanding that they didn't need to have all the answers to be happy together. But she couldn't deny that there were things she needed to figure out for herself, paths she needed to walk on her own. One morning, as she walked through the newly sprouted paths of the park, surrounded by budding trees and fresh grass, Carla felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had spent so many years chasing after stories, seeking to uncover the truths of the world, of people, of places. But in the quiet of this small town, she had discovered something far more elusive and much more profound, the truth of herself. But now, with the seasons changing, she felt an urge to go beyond, to explore the wider world once more, to put her writing into new contexts. Her time here had taught her how to listen more carefully, how to observe, how to see beyond the surface. But there was a calling inside her, a desire to share the story of this town, of its people, in a way that the world outside of it could truly understand. She stopped at the bench overlooking the small lake, the water rippling gently as the wind blew across the surface. In the distance, she could hear the sound of children playing, the hum of life in the town continuing its cycle. She sat down slowly, her fingers gently tracing the edge of the bench. The quiet solitude was something she had learned to treasure in her time here. In the city, solitude often felt lonely, an absence, a reminder of what was missing. But here, in this peaceful town, solitude felt like a gift. It was a space where she could hear herself think, where she could embrace the stillness and feel it fill her with a quiet strength. As Carla sat there, the weight of her thoughts seemed to grow heavier. She had always been driven, always searching for the next big story, the next opportunity. But in the years she had spent in the city, chasing stories, she had lost touch with the simple joys of life. It was here, in this town, that she had learned to slow down, to live in the moment, to understand that the most important stories were often the ones hidden in plain sight. The stories of love, of struggle, of kindness, and of everyday heroes. Carla smiled softly to herself. She knew now that this was the story she was meant to tell. The story of a town that believed in the magic of Christmas, of community, and of second chances. She could write about it. She could write about the people, the traditions, the way the town had embraced her and had helped her embrace herself. And then there was Chris. He had been the anchor in her life, the steady presence that had helped her find her way. But she knew now that the road ahead wasn't just about him or the town. It was about her, too, about what she wanted for herself, and how she could honor both the past and the future that was waiting for her. She reached into her bag and pulled out a notebook, a simple black leather journal that she had kept tucked away for months. The pages were filled with scribbled thoughts, half-formed sentences, ideas that had come to her in quiet moments. But now, with a sense of clarity, she opened to a fresh page and began to write. The words flowed freely as she wrote about the town, about the people, about Chris. She wrote about how she had come here skeptical and jaded, and how she had found something she hadn't known she needed. But now, it was more than just a personal story. It was a story for the world to see. The world needed to know about this town, about the miracle of Christmas that wasn't just a holiday but a way of life. The miracle of love, of community, of belonging. She could be the one to share it. By the time she had finished writing, the sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. Carla closed the notebook and stood up, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She wasn't sure how the world would receive her story or what the future would hold, but she knew it was time to share it. She had found her voice again, and this time, she knew exactly what she had to say. As she walked back toward town, the wind brushing against her face, she felt a renewed sense of hope, of excitement for what was to come. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she had learned something valuable over the past few months. She didn't need to have everything figured out. She just needed to be true to herself, to follow the path that felt right, even when it wasn't easy. When she returned to the heart of the town, she found Chris waiting for her by the fountain. His eyes lit up when he saw her, and for a moment, it felt like everything had come full circle. Like the two of them were finally in sync, each walking their own path, yet bound together by a shared love. "There you are," Chris said, his voice warm. "How was your walk?" Carla smiled, walking over to him. "It was perfect," she said, her voice filled with quiet excitement. "I've decided what I want to do. I'm going to write about the town, about the people, about the Christmas miracle. I want to share it with the world." Chris's eyes softened, and a proud smile spread across his face. "I knew you'd find a way to share the magic of this place." Carla leaned into him, her heart full. "It's more than magic," she said quietly. "It's real, and I want to make sure the world knows that." Together, they stood there for a long moment, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft hues of pink and orange. The world around them was alive with possibility, and for the first time in a long while, Carla felt that everything was as it should be.